Thank you for joining the Art Gallery of Regina for Ruth Chambers' solo exhibition of over 60 lifelike bulbs and flowering plants faithfully observed and sculpted by hand in lightly tinted porcelain. This exhibition runs from February 5th to April 11th in the Art Gallery of Regina's main gallery. Ruth Chambers joins me to talk about her exhibition, Tend. Can you explain the title of your exhibition, Tend?
Sure. I spent a lot of time trying to come up with a title, and it was not easy because there's a lot of things going on in the exhibition, but this term had a relationship with quite a few things that I was thinking about. It reminds me of words like attend to, tender, and it also has associations with being careful and with giving value to things. Plants, the subject to some extent of this exhibition, require tending. Gardeners tend to their plants, but also I tend to my practice of making, which is also a part of the exhibition. And then finally, it's a little bit of message to the viewer to pay attention and to tend carefully to the work. It's quite quiet work and it takes a little bit of time. And if you tend to something, you spend time with it and you do it attentively. So there's a whole bunch of things that are going on in the title.
I love that there is so much meaning packed into that little word. It's like a bulb, actually, that a huge flower is going to spring forth from. There's all of these meanings. So let's tend and bring our attention to the exhibition. Maybe we'll start going clockwise from the door, so to our left if we've just walked in the gallery door. So the works on this wall and kind of going all around the walls of the gallery are grouped together under a title, Looking at Hollyhocks Italia. What is a hollyhock and why were you drawn to hollyhocks as a subject?
So hollyhocks are an interesting plant because they grow in Saskatchewan quite happily. They like our weather. They're not natural to Saskatchewan, but they have been to some extent naturalized in my garden and in many places in urban Saskatchewan. When I say naturalized in my garden, I don't plant them. They just come up. And these are models that I used, that I grew. There was a big patch that I used to visit in my grandmother's garden. So I have associations with childhood. And they also have a really interesting long history, like many cultural artifacts. They came from the Far East to the Middle East, and then to England and Europe.
It's incredible, just like somebody like me with European settler ancestry that plunked down in this new place and suddenly a survivor through dry summers and cold winters. Yes. So if we look at the first hollyhock on the wall, can you describe it and maybe talk a little bit about what is special about this one?
Each of these sculptures are modeled from specific plants. So they're like a portrait of a plant, but they're also very specific moments because, as we know, plants change. And this has I've attempted to capture the moment when the plant is blooming in the middle. In the top, there are buds that are going to bloom soon. You can sort of see the flower picking out at the third one down. And then there's the full bloom, and then there's one below that that has started to wilt.
Hollyhocks are human height. I didn't pick up on this until you mentioned this, but these are hung at the height where the top of the flower would normally reach.
That's right. If we saw the full plant, it would go from about where it is now all the way down to the ground. Or if you were in a garden looking at it, you would look at it at approximately this height.
And then the next one along is dramatically different. It's all these tightly coiled little fists almost all the way up the stem. What is happening with this hollyhock?
So it has gone to seed for the most part. So the blossoms have fallen off and the seed pods have started to form. You can see one blossom that is about to fall off. And then the rest of these fists that you're mentioning have seeds underneath of them. The seeds are still quite light colored. they get darker as they get mature. So if you look closely at the seeds, you'll see that they're sort of whitish, and that's what color they are before the seeds mature. So the seeds aren't mature on this one yet, but the pods have formed.
It's really incredible to imagine that you've sculpted all of this detail by hand, that inside of these seed pods are the seeds, and we can see them kind of through the little cracks there. The third one along, I happen to know that this one is rather special. Can you explain what is so special about this third hollyhock with these pale pink petals?
So this one was a moment where I was lucky enough to bring the top of the plant into my studio immediately after the first killing frost. And so those petals that you see at the top are flowers that have gone from being open and mature and big, and then the frost has killed them. And so they've slumped and just fallen down. And they're only going to stay like that for a little bit because they're still got some moisture and life in them. But over the next few days, they're probably going to fall off and die. So this is just like an instant where they almost are still frozen in time. And you can also tell a little bit that the plant was at a stage earlier than the one we just talked about, because there's some green left in it. There's some green leaves on it. And the seed pods are a little bit greenish. They haven't completely gotten brown yet. So I tried to replicate or reference that moment right after the first frost, where everything in your garden, if you're a gardener, is all of a sudden the next day gone from being full and bright and upright to all of a sudden starting to fall down.
It's really quite incredible. Not only are these sort of individual portraits of these plants, but also a snapshot of this very short-lived moment. This frost, it would be something that these wilted, tender petals would only be like that for maybe a day, and then they might turn black and become much less pretty.
Yes, that's right.
In a way, these are sort of ghostly portraits of these plants because of this pale color, as if they've been drained of their vitality, that they've really been kind of frozen in time in this delicate vitrified clay. What color would this hollyhock have been when it was in full bloom?
The pastel colors are just toned down versions of the color it would have been. So I do look quite carefully at the color. And then I sort of water it down a lot. So the top would have been pink or red. The leaves would have been much more of an intense green. And then the browns and the yellows would have been brownish yellow. So in addition to trying to be quite accurate in my portrait of the specific plant in the specific moment, I'm also trying to reference the colors quite precisely. But as you said, they're sort of just traces of the color rather than the intense realism of the color. The idea of the trace is in there a little bit.
It's also maybe an important signal to viewers, as incredibly detailed and lifelike as your sculptures are. They're not exactly reproducing life. It's like how a magician has to let viewers know that there is a carefully crafted illusion. It's not just magic that didn't just happen. These are carefully crafted.
That's a very interesting analogy. Yes.
The last hollyhock on this wall here, or the last of these four, what can you tell me about this one?
This one is fairly early on in the season. And so the top, again, you can see fresh buds that are going to turn into flowers. And there's one flower that's sort of starting to unfurl, where you can see that the petals haven't quite opened up yet.
These minute differences that I'm learning about these plants, that the buds are these kind of almost teardrop shaped, smaller structures, whereas the seed pods are these kind of fat. As I said, they remind me of a fist clutching onto the seeds. A wilted blossom as opposed to a frost-killed blossom. And this one has this amazing blossom that's just like a flag trying to unfurl itself. So this back wall to the gallery here, we have 3 groupings of bulbs, but these also fall under the title of Hollyhocks Italia. And I'm guessing that these would be the Italia. What does Italia mean? And why have you used the full phrase rather than the abbreviation et al. That we encounter more often?
Et al. Or Italia mean and others. And I mean it quite literally. And I didn't really want to use the short form that we're more familiar with because it's associated with citations. And I wanted to literally reference the term and others, and also the Latin that we often use to name plants, the scientific names of plants.
Yes, exactly. It's not like a list of authors of a book, but this poetic dead language that we use to name these vigorously growing things. First grouping of 5 bulbs. What kind of bulbs are they?
Those are tulip bulbs.
So some of these bulbs are just sending out their tender little shoots and their tiny little roots. How do you achieve such stunning detail where you're sculpting these almost thread-like fingers of root or the papery overlapping skins on the bulb?
Well, it's done by hand. It's done through trial and error, and it's done repetitively. So I practice. And I have quite a few failures, and I'm just very careful when I'm making them and very focused. I have to be quite attentive, and so I can't, sit down and work on these all day because it takes quite a bit of energy.
You mentioned how you need to practice and really pay attention to this. And I know that this whole body of work in the exhibition tent came out of a residency you did in Denmark. Can you tell me about that residency and how you first came upon the bulb or the flower as a subject?
I went to do an artist residency, which is a chance to be very focused and reflective and pay only attention to your work rather than the many other things that we tend to be involved with when we're at home. And I went with the intention of working on the still life because I had been interested in a couple of years in a whole range of aspects of the genre of the still life. When I got there, they had spring bulbs out. It was February. And I thought, well, these would be very interesting components of a still life. So I started with the bulb and then I just got stuck with it and haven't moved much beyond since then. So my still life subject became quite singular.
As you say, this process is rooted, no pun intended, so strongly in looking, in observation, and faithful replication. How long about would it take you to make one of these porcelain pieces that we see here?
They vary because some of them have a lot more detail than others. And some of them, once I've practiced for a while, I'm faster at. But I figure I make about a piece a week. I probably spend 2 or 3 hours 4 or 5 days a week. And by the end of that, have one piece on average. But there are also many other things going on, like firing, like preparing the clay.
And so that 1 week would be the process of sculpting the wet porcelain by hand, not including the time it takes to carefully dry it and transfer it to the kiln to fire it.
The firing process is quite intensive. I have to prepare sort of beds for some of them in order that they survive the firing and don't break or crack during the firing.
This group of 3 bulbs in the middle here, these aren't tulip bulbs.
Those are crocus.
I can recognize those slender little shoots coming up, the ones that poke through the snow in the rare times that we get snow in Vancouver. I would always see that's when the crocus would choose to come up. And then finally, this last group of bulbs, what kind of bulbs are those?
Those are more crocus, and they are just in earlier stages. So I was doing a study of the bulbs before they burst out. And I guess that's one of the important components that's reflected in this piece, as well as in a couple of the other pieces, the practice of studying. Some of them are the same bulb that has started to grow over the process of studying it. I take them and I put them in the fridge if I haven't finished working on them to sort of freeze them in that moment. And then I let them grow for a bit, and then I study them again and make another bulb of them moving into their next phase.
So not only have you arrested each bulb or flower for a fleeting moment in time, but we might see a few moments in the life of a bulb or a flowering plant. And you also mentioned close observation, and it brings me back to your title, Looking at Hollyhocks Italia. I do believe that titles often serve to draw the viewer's attention to certain aspects and meanings of an artwork. Why did you deliberately underscore the act of looking for the artist and for the viewer?
Well, it's a very specific kind of looking. It's slow, attentive looking that happens over time. And I guess that's related to what I was just talking about in sort of looking at these over time as they evolve. It also, to some extent, sets up in my mind, and it's not explicit, but it sets up a contrast between a lot of the looking that we do in our contemporary lives, which is fast, 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 and scanning, whereas this is sort of the opposite of that kind of looking.
It's really in-depth looking that both you have carried out and you're sort of asking the viewer also to take on, to really examine the detail here. Looking at Hollyhocks Italia continues on to the next wall there, and we have once again single hollyhocks. Another thing that strikes me about the way that you've hung your artworks is not only are they hung sort of at the height that the full plant would be, but that they are suspended away from wires, and they almost seem as if they're weightless. They look incredibly fragile. They are incredibly fragile. They're also very individually isolated. So what is the effect of removing and closely examining one spray of blossoms as opposed to an arrangement, a cluster, or a fistful of flowers?
That is really well articulated, and in a way embedded in your question is sort of the answer, and that is that I am doing these as individual portraits, and I want to explore them as sort of delicate, fragile, individual studies, and separating them out from a cluster, taking them in from the garden allows me to be attentive in that way.
We can also maybe discuss each of these and what is unique about each of these specimens on this wall. Start on the left or to the west. This one looks like it's another hollyhock that has gone to seed.
It is, and it's the most mature. So the stem has actually started to bend. It's no longer going straight up, and it's gotten quite a bit browner. And the seed pods are starting to open up a little bit. The seeds are going to fall out. And if you look from the side into the bottom seed pod, you can see that they're also black. Well, they're gray in this case. And you can imagine how the leaves that cover those seeds are going to open up. And I like your analogy of a fist opening up, because that's very much what happens in the seeds burst out. And you can see how this is sort of on the verge of doing that.
The detail is so overwhelming. It's really wonderful. And this next one along, this bloom sort of towards the bottom of the stem is open. It's almost like a dinner plate.
Yes, it's open. It's got quite a few buds on the top that are going to open over time. The way that this plant grows, as many plants do, is that the top continues to grow up and produce buds. And you can see the little tiny buds on the top that are going to get bigger and bigger, and then they're going to turn into this sort of plate-like flower.
I think the third one along might be my favorite because there's so much happening here. We can see simultaneously on this one stem so many different phases of growth with the different blossoms.
Yes, that's right. It's as if some of the other ones are collapsed into this one. And I think this one was a really robust, very healthy, well-nourished, well-watered, because it is kind of cram-packed full of blossoms and buds and seed pods. And the top is sort of insisting on continuing to grow, even though a little bit below the seed pods have already formed. So it had lots of energy to continue to grow. If you look on the top, you can see lots of little tiny buds, again, that are going to be continuing to grow straight up. And they're clustered together, the pods and the buds on this one, in a different way than they are on some of the others that would have not produced quite as much in one area of the stem. So yes, you're right, there's a fully open or almost fully open flower. There's one that's going to be open soon, and then there's one that's starting to fall off.
I can't help but look at this one metaphorically in terms of its vigor, and this flower that's opening is like a bugle, and all of the curled seed pods that are distributed along the stem are like a stick of jingle bells. It just seems incredibly joyous. So the fourth one along, this one looks very succulent.
There's a couple of blossoms on this one, and they're in a sort of a soft yellow. And then there's another blossom that's going to unfurl soon. And you can see some of the seed pods that are still quite green and they haven't started to open up at all on the bottom. And then some of the buds on the top.
This fifth one along, this one to me, it seems the one that has been most cut off at the bottom. And I guess because there's a blossom happening so close to where the stem has been cut.
Yeah, that's true. It almost looks like it's upside down because the blossom is so close to the bottom of the stem.
And then this delicate, tiny final hollyhock on this wall.
In contrast to the one at the end of this wall, which is the most advanced in terms of maturity, this is the least advanced in terms of maturity. None of the buds have even started to open up yet. There's lots of leaves that are sort of going to be eclipsed in a week or two, probably by the blossoms, and then fall off when the seed pods start to grow. And then there's a really tight cluster of tiny, tiny little buds that are again going to continue to grow up and grow into more and more flowers. So you can see a lot of potential in this one. And if you counted the buds, you could see that there's probably 15 flowers that are going to emerge over time from the tip of this plant.
It's interesting that you've mentioned that you've deliberately captured many phases within the Hollyhock's development. Although they're all made out of the same material, this hard-fired porcelain, I get such a sense of the texture of what the flower it was modeled from would be, from this one being kind of dried out and brittle and that bend to it, to something that would be very tender and floppy in terms of the very youngest one. Again, the power of observation and very, very careful, practiced sculpting. Well, shall we turn our attention now to these three works on these display tables? Bulb unfolding, close observations on making and growing. These three tables here, they have a distinctly different vocabulary from the works that are pinned to the walls. Both are falling upon a display traditions of museum specimens. And especially we see flower heads, bulbs, buds, plant cuttings, both withered and succulent, displayed together and pinned to this rich black fabric. To me, this most clearly signals your interest in historical botanical illustrators, many of whom were women. Can you tell me about some of these illustrators and how their works served as an inspiration for you?
Sure. And maybe I'll contextualize that by a more general comment on the study of botany in the 16th and 17th centuries, when they were really intentionally and deliberately trying to learn about plant life of all kinds, where there was a real scientific interest, but also a scientific interest that was not particularly separate from a creative or artistic interest. And that moment when those two fields operated together is very interesting to me. There was a convention of making, as people probably know, botanical posters, and there was a small subgenre of those botanical posters that displayed the whole range of the life of a plant on a single black background, and I found them quite dramatic. Similarly, one of the illustrators from the 18th century who has become very well known for an amazing body of work she created is Mary Delaney, and she worked with cut paper on black. She was a bit of an innovator in that she invented this use of cutting paper, colored paper that she would color on her own and then cut it up and then replicate as carefully as possible the plants that she was looking at. And then she mounted them on black and compiled them into a massive volume that's in the Victorian Albert now and has become quite recognized for her innovative illustration of plants. I'm also interested in how predominant women have been in botanical illustrations relative to many other genres of visual art. There are many, and Sandee, you've educated me to some extent about why that is the case, which is fascinating.
It struck me that your project here is essentially kind of a feminist project because it does connect back to this heritage of female botanical illustrators who were either unrecognized, uncredited, or very often they would preface their works with an apologia, an apology to the reader, and it explained what tragic circumstance of penury and loss had forced them to have a job which was not done for women of the time. They were really forced to make an excuse and explain why they were both having a job but also daring to step their foot into the domain of science. So maybe let's look at the first table here. Is this all the same flower?
It is. It's what we call a paperwhite, or a narcissus is the other term for it. And they're blossoming, they're budding. I did manage to bring myself to slice one of the bulbs open so that I could study what was going on inside of a bulb. And then there's a whole bunch of little studies of the flower as it starts to open.
I love that bulb that has been sliced open. It does call back to this scientific thirst for knowledge where we're going to cut things open and see what they're like on the inside, what makes them go. This practice of showing the entire life cycle of the plant, I really recognize this as hearkening back to botanical illustration and scientific exploration. The middle table, is that all the same type of plant as well?
The middle table is the iris, and I source my models in various ways. Sometimes they are from my garden. Sometimes I buy them at a supermarket. Sometimes I buy them at a gardening center. And this one has two different types of iris, a miniature iris. There's also a blue iris that's very common in the garden. Beside the central blue iris, there's a model of it as it started to wilt.
The third one here, this looks to me as if different types of flowering plants have been juxtaposed in one tableau.
Well, actually, these are all gladiolus. And they're at different stages. The central bottom part, the spears, are them before they have started to open up at all. There's a couple where the glad has started to go to seed. And if you grow a glad in your garden, it will go to seed. If you buy it at a flower shop, it will just start to wilt, and that is illustrated on the top left. But there are also two versions where I've grown the glad in my garden and allowed it to go to seed, and you can see how it's changed over time. And that's probably why they look like there's more than one type of flower in here, because they're all at different stages. There are also a couple of gladiolia bulbs that were dug in the fall.
You referenced this a little bit earlier, but in the 17th century France, the concept of beaux-arts and this splitting apart of art and science. The sciences were seen as dependent upon mathematics and factual knowledge, where arts were thought to be dominated by talent and taste. And it seems to me that you're reinventing the role of the artist with the method, the exacting measures, and the dispassionate observation that have become the domain of science. You've really kind of brought back together this exploratory method of the scientist with the incredible attention to detail of the artist.
I wouldn't say reinvented, because I think that artists do it all the time, but maybe I'm just being a bit more conscious of working that way. And I mentioned trial and error, and that is a scientific method for sure, but it's also an artistic method.
Yeah, exactly. I kind of agree. It's not necessarily reinvention, but people tend to think of the scientists' research as what they do, and the artist's research and experimentation is not thought of as what artists do. It's the final product that we think is what artists do. We should change our thinking about actually what do artists do. Let's circle around to this darkly stained wooden oval table, tulip table. We know that flowers have many meanings, and you had mentioned earlier still life, and this idea that in the European tradition of still life painting, that cut flowers that quickly wilt and die often represent the fleetingness of life and a moralistic message of how we should think beyond these pleasures and indulgences that will also quickly fade. Are you referencing, by putting these flowers together in these arrangements in this way, any kind of culturally specific meanings of flowers?
Not so much, because I know there are some conventions where each individual flower has a symbolic meaning. I'm more alluding to your comment and discussion of the still life and the ideas inherent in the still life, especially that contradiction inherent in the still life, which is fascinating to me. The contradiction between suggesting that we really shouldn't pay attention to the physical world, the material world, the lusciousness of life, because it's going to all be lost. Nevertheless, the still life painters spent a lot of time making very beautiful material objects. And I have an interest in that relationship between the material world and the metaphysical world. So that's where my interest in still life comes to. And this piece is probably the closest to those ideas, as opposed to the other pieces, which are not so much compositions, but this is a composition.
I've never really picked up on what you said there, and I think it's so insightful and sort of funny that still life painters, they were painting in this kind of moralizing way, and yet they were really giving themselves to the pleasure of representing these decadent, luscious arrangements. And of course, flowers and different foodstuffs, they were sort of a globally traded commodity. You mentioned when you first talked about the hollyhock, how its roots are in Asia and it had been transplanted and brought through trade to many places in the world. I also think about tulip mania in the Dutch Republic that peaked in 1637 when a single tulip bulb could be worth more than 10 times the annual salary of a skilled worker. In a way, I think it's almost a wonderful invitation to say, maybe we don't have to outrageously value these things, but we can value them, these beautiful fleeting flowers.
Well, thank you for picking up also on the idea of commodity, because that's an inherent contradiction in this work. Certainly, some of these flowers came through a global commodification network and came from the grocery store, where they've been grown in South America under really questionable, even dystopic circumstances. I also reflect on those things as I'm working with these beautiful, beautiful objects that have embedded in them some questions around commodity and consumption.
It's so interesting, even what you mentioned about the gladiola that come from the grocery store, how they don't go to seed. It's like, well, what are these? They're not real flowers. So maybe your carefully sculpted porcelain renderings are, in a sense, more real than grocery store flowers that are grown in a hothouse where people are exploited. Greenhouse gases are created through this transportation over long distances. We also talked about still life in this kind of grouping, extravagant piles of delightful things. How did you make your decisions about how things on the tulip table were grouped together?
It was very much an aesthetic decision, but I will also mention that this piece is more of an experiment for me. It's less controlled. It's more about testing the tabletop as a surface for these ceramic objects. Ceramic objects are very commonly associated with the tabletop, so there's a bit of a play about that. But there's also a casualness to it that I wanted to use to express how that this might be a moment of organization of materials for a gardener or for a florist or in a domestic environment. I guess the casualness and the testing of arrangement and testing of composition is part of this piece.
I really love that you brought the word domestic in. It's a delicious insight into an artist's process of experimenting. Well, what happens if I put this with this? This here. Can you tell me a little bit about if there were deliberate decisions made about the color palette for Tulip Table, and also how you achieve color? Because porcelain itself, in its natural form, will be white, and you have a very special way of tinting these works.
Yeah, some of the color on this table is a little bit more robust. There are a lot of subtle greens on this table. So if you look carefully, the greens, some of them are more obviously different, but they all are subtly different. There are some pieces where the bulbs are referencing earth more than any of the other work in here. So the little tiny tulip bulbs have traces of dirt on them, as do some of the other bulbs, or at least appear to have traces of dirt on them. I blend a ceramic stain into the porcelain. And these are mineral-based colorants that will still remain in the porcelain after it's brought to a really high temperature in a firing process. I mix it really carefully right into the porcelain. Sometimes you can see on some of the bulbs, it's sort of just rubbed into the surface of the clay too.
Most commonly, ceramics, including porcelain, would be glazed, and that would make things usually quite shiny, I guess, depending on the formulation of the glaze. What are the reasons that you chose to pigment the porcelain itself rather than applying a glaze and firing a second time?
In my opinion, glazes are really meant to be used for functional wear. That's what they were developed for. Everything from industrial sanitary furniture like sinks to tiles for buildings to plates that you eat off of. The whole realm of really beautiful, fascinating, shiny ceramic surfaces were developed for those purposes. But we have really no need for these forms to be shiny or durable, and there doesn't seem to be any sense to glazing this work. I'm not going to eat off of it. I'm not going to need to scrub it down. And I also feel like it would be quite a distraction from the form. When there's a glaze on a surface, you don't notice the texture and the detail within the surface the same way you do before there's a glaze on the surface. And then finally, without the glaze, it's much closer to the feeling that it has when they're initially made in the studio and the clay is still a little bit soft and a little bit wet.
On Tulip Table, there are 2 bulbs that have been repaired. And we talked earlier about how things can break when they're being fired in the kiln, and potentially glazing a ceramic item and refiring it. You're again putting it back in the fire, risking it again. The repaired bulbs are kind of a wonderful metaphor for the way that a bulb will be kind of burst apart, broken apart by this vigorous plant springing forth. What can you tell me about the process of repairing those bulbs and the story that you want people to get from viewing them?
Well, that's interesting because certainly what you speak about is part of it. It also took quite a bit of time and work to repair them, but they weren't repaired perfectly. So to some extent, I decided to put them in the exhibition because I wanted to test what they did mean. Well, they've been actually sitting on a table in my studio, and I've been looking at them since I decided to repair them. And I've had an intuition that there is something that adds something to the work that to me, it makes it a little bit more interesting. And it also recognizes that repaired objects are also of value.
I like the idea that repaired objects should be of value. Maybe if we do that more, we'll have more ground to grow flowers in and preserve some species. Well, Ruth, I want to thank you for guiding us through the exhibition Tend.